Greetings and welcome to this ninth mini lecture on the Constitution. In the last lecture, I talked a little bit about the notion of a confederation, that in a confederation, the political power is vested in the subnational governments, which in America we call states. Um, I told you that most political experts believe that the Articles of Confederation was a failed government. And certainly it is true, there are not a lot of examples of confederations that last very long historically. One confederation that lasted about 40 years was the old Confederation of the Rhine amongst the German states. And the crisis of identity was a much bigger problem in the creation of a unified Germany than in the United States, because Germany, as I mentioned earlier with the 30 Years' War, is about evenly divided between a Protestant North and a Catholic South, and the history of regionalism is very strong there. And so even today, the states, which they call Länder in Germany, and there are 16 of them in Germany, the German states are far more powerful than American states. German states are far more financially independent from the national government than our states. And so that crisis of identity in the German case created much stronger states than even in the United States. And I'll talk about this battle between the national government and the states when I talk about federalism. So, in our first government, the Articles of Confederation, political power or sovereignty was rooted in the states because of that identity crisis from the colonial period, and because we had fought a tremendous war and revolution against a strong unitary state like Great Britain. I also mentioned that the structure of the national government was very different, that instead of having three very independent and strong national institutions, the only decision making institution of any value was the Congress, a unicameral Congress that had representation based on geography, like the U.S. Senate does today. And in fact, I would say that the only faint fingerprint from the Articles of Confederation is the U.S. Senate, just as the Congress was based on geography under the Articles. We retained that with the U.S. Senate, and I'll talk a lot about that when I get to Congress. In this mini lecture, I want to talk about the weaknesses of the Articles, because what's most interesting is, why did this government fail so quickly? And I'm going to give you this quote a few times. I have it written down in the notes. It's a paraphrase, it's not an exact translation. But Alexander Hamilton, who was the hero of the only great teacher I had in high school, was my government teacher. I had a wonderful woman who probably had more of an influence on me than any other teacher until college. She was a, a good teacher, not a great teacher, but an absolutely fabulous human being. Just wonderful, and she influenced me a lot more in terms of mentoring and just showing concern for me. Uh, had a great teacher, a government teacher, and her hero was Alexander Hamilton. And so I was uh, given a lot of Hamilton quotes. We had to read all of Hamilton's contributions, from being Treasury Secretary to Federalist writer to a whole variety of things. I really like this quote. I think it's really true, and I think it means a lot more than many students think. So follow along with me in the notes. Alexander Hamilton claimed that the two most essential powers of any government, any, whether it's a republic, whether it's a monarchy, whether it's a religious regime, any government, were the powers of the purse, that's taxing and spending, power of the purse, taxing and spending, and the power of the sword, raising and using a military. Now, Hamilton's claim was that if the government lacked either one, it was doomed to failure. And of course, under the Articles of Confederation, not only did the national government lack one of these, the national government lacked both of these essential powers and therefore was doomed to failure. There were several article weaknesses, but I want to illustrate the three that I think, frankly, are most significant. So, under the power of the purse, you would see that under A, an inability to tax. So, under the Articles of Confederation, the national government could ask the states for money, but could not compel them to pay. Now, think about that. Imagine if the IRS changed the rules this year and made taxation completely voluntary. So you could pay as much or as little of your federal taxes as you deemed appropriate. So the national government in this case would be relying on our patriotism, our sense of fair play, and assuming that we'll do our fair share. In my case, there are some things that the government does that I like. There's a whole bunch I don't like. So in my case, I would probably send them, I don't know, a quarter of what I'm supposed to. And that is exactly what happened under the Articles. The national government asked the states, couldn't compel them to pay, and as a result, as your notes point out, the last full year in 1786, before the Constitutional Convention, the total revenue of the national government was less than the interest that was owed on our national debt. It is estimated that the states contributed about 25% of what was asked by the national government. And you can imagine that if your revenue is only about 25% of what you're anticipating, pretty soon you're going to be on the verge of national bankruptcy. So there is strike one against this first government. The national government could not tax, and it had the country soon teetering on the verge of national bankruptcy. The second one is a big one, and it's one that I'm going to mention several times. You're going to hear this phrase multiple times. The national government was unable to regulate interstate commerce. And I referred to this in an earlier mini lecture. I don't remember if it was in the last one or the mini lecture before. But there was not a national court system, and the result of that was there were numerous squabbles between the states. New York and New Jersey argued who owned the islands in the harbor. I told you about Ellis Island being an example of that. I told you about Virginia and Maryland battling over fishing rights in the Potomac. States engaged in predatory taxation against citizens of other states. So when farmers in New Jersey wanted to sell their produce in New York imposed discriminatory taxes against them to increase revenue for themselves and without an umpire. And you see, that is a very valuable role of the government, to be an umpire of disputes. Perhaps you've never thought of it this way, and perhaps it's never been explained this way. I will let you in on a little secret. There's a lot of coach in me. I've coached everything from youth basketball at the elementary level to, for several years, being an assistant softball coach at Merced College. So, in this particular case, judges are like umpires. And for those of you who are athletes in here, you know that umpires aren't always consistent. You might have a baseball or softball umpire that has a very broad strike zone. And then if you're playing a doubleheader, the next umpire may have a very tight strike zone, and you almost have to throw it down the middle to get him to call a strike. Now, the rule book has the same strike zone, but it's interpreted very, very differently. And so, just as there are umpires athletically, the courts are the umpires of disputes in society. And so, not having a national court system meant that there were no umpires when the states get into battle. My home state of Kentucky sued their neighbors Indiana and Ohio most notably, over who owned the Ohio River at one time. Now, you would think, given the name of the river, that Ohio might have a pretty good claim, but actually Kentucky prevailed. And I remember in the dispute between Kentucky and Indiana, kind of the rule of thumb was that assuming you could hold your breath and walk from Kentucky across the river to Indiana, you were in Kentucky until your head popped up on the Indiana side. Now, the reason why Kentucky sued their neighbor was the states were squabbling over who got to tax the coal barges that went up and down the river. So Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio were all trying to raise revenue by taxation, and Kentucky in that case prevailed. The third, and probably the most important, and some would argue, some would say that the inability to tax was most important. But certainly when Europeans took a look at the United States and when they started kind of making fun of this new country, it was for letter C, an inability to raise an army or navy. So when the Revolutionary War ended, the military was disbanded. The British refused to decamp from their forts along the Great Lakes. When American diplomats protested, the British kind of laughed and refused to get out of their forts, and there was nothing we could really do. Also, shortly after the Revolution, Spanish gunboats, old, antiquated, began hassling American shipping that was going up and down the Mississippi River. Once again, without a navy, the United States and American merchants were really unable to protect their interest, and they were prone to predatory attacks by these Spanish gunboats. If there is a straw that breaks the camel's back, star the event that's at the top of your notes, where it says in 1786 there was a farmers' revolt in western Massachusetts called Sheas Rebellion. You should know Sheas Rebellion. The event isn't important because it was successful. It wasn't successful. The governor of Massachusetts was able to put the rebellion down. But the event is incredibly important because now, for the first time, many people saw that it wasn't tyranny that was the only political evil. That certainly a government too strong like Great Britain could be horrendous, could abuse your rights. But now, many people in the United States realized that if the government was too weak, that government would be unable to protect our rights. So a government too strong is tyrannical and a threat to our rights. A government too weak teeters on anarchy and is unable to protect our rights. And in this case, you had farmers who in many cases were Revolutionary War veterans. Banks were foreclosing on their farms. And these farmers decided the best way to resolve this was to burn the bank down, which would burn their mortgages, and therefore the banks would be unable to foreclose. Daniel Shays was a captain in the Revolutionary War, and he led this farmers' revolt. So I will ask a question. I think the question says something like, there was a farmers' revolt in western Massachusetts that symbolized the weaknesses of the article. What was this called? And you should know Sheas Rebellion was that farmers' revolt. In the next mini lecture, we're going to talk about the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The Constitutional Convention at first was supposed to be merely a reform movement to fix the weaknesses of the articles, and some delegates went there as reformers, trying to keep as much of the articles as possible. But the people who led the Constitutional Convention believed that the articles were beyond being reformed and that we needed to create a whole new system of government, and that is exactly what happens. See you soon.